My father laughed so hard he nearly spilled his iced tea. He trains Navy SEALs, he said, pointing proudly at my younger brother. Then he looked across the picnic table and asked another guest, "What does your daughter even do?" 30 seconds later, a retired admiral stood frozen, staring at me as though he'd seen a ghost. I wished I could disappear. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in early June, and my father had invited nearly 50 people to celebrate his 66th birthday at his home in Norfol, Virginia. The backyard was crowded with folding chairs, red and blue paper decorations, and the smell of hamburgers cooking on the grill. Someone had country music, playing through an old Bluetooth speaker. Children chased each other across the lawn, while their grandparents argued about baseball and the price of groceries. On the surface, it looked like the kind of family gathering people remembered fondly. For me, it felt like walking back into a room I'd spent 20 years trying to leave. I parked my gray Honda Accord at the curb and sat behind the steering wheel for almost a full minute before getting out. The drive from Arlington had taken a little over 3 hours, and I'd rehearsed this visit the whole way down Interstate 95. Smile. Be polite, don't stay too late. Most importantly, don't let Dad get under your skin. I grabbed the blueberry pie I'd bought from a bakery outside Fredericksburg and walked toward the backyard gate. Before I even stepped inside, I heard my father's voice booming over everyone else's. "There she is," he called. Every head turned. I smiled. "Happy birthday, Dad." He gave me a quick hug with one arm. "You made it." I said I would. He nodded distractedly before turning back toward another conversation. That was pretty typical. My younger brother Jason walked over a moment later, wearing khaki shorts and a navy polo shirt. He hugged me tighter than our father had. "You survived the traffic barely." He laughed. "I told Dad you should have come down yesterday." I had work, I know. Jason never asked questions about my job. Not because he wasn't curious, because he'd learned years ago that I couldn't answer most of them. "You hungry?" he asked. "I could eat." "Good." Dad already burned the first batch. That made me laugh. Some things never changed. Jason had always been easy to love. He was 42 now, broad-shouldered, confident without being arrogant, and one of the most respected instructors at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado. He trained future SEALs. It was demanding work, and he deserved every bit of recognition he received. None of my frustration had ever been with Jason. It had always been with the way our parents compared us. Growing up, Jason's achievements filled entire photo albums, football trophies, graduation pictures, military promotions. My accomplishments rarely made it onto the refrigerator. Dad used to joke that I was the quiet kid. Mom would say, "Emily never asks for attention." She was right. Eventually, I stopped expecting it. I spent the next hour talking with cousins I hadn't seen since Christmas and helping refill coolers with bottled water and soda. It was almost pleasant. Almost. The then Dad gathered everyone near the picnic tables to introduce a few special guests. "I want everybody to meet Admiral Thomas Reynolds," he announced. A tall man with silver hair nodded politely. Even retired, he carried himself like someone who expected discipline without asking for it. Beside him stood his wife Margaret, smiling warmly at everyone. Dad clapped Jason on the shoulder. "And this guy right here?" He grinned proudly. "My son trains Navy SEALs." Several guests applauded. Someone whistled. Jason looked embarrassed. "Dad, no. Let me brag a little." People laughed. Then Dad noticed another family standing nearby. One of the fathers had just mentioned his daughter worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs. Dad chuckled. "Well, that's respectable." Then he pointed toward Jason. "But this guy trains Navy SEALs." More laughter. He looked around dramatically. "What does your daughter even do?" The words hit me harder than they should have. Not because he had asked about someone else's daughter, because I knew exactly why he never asked that question about me. He'd stopped asking years ago. People glanced in my direction anyway. A few looked uncomfortable. I picked up my glass of sweet tea and took a slow sip. Just breathe. Don't react. The moment will pass. Then Admiral Reynolds turned toward me. His expression changed so suddenly, I almost thought he was looking at someone behind me. He narrowed his eyes, studied my face. His wife noticed. "Tom." He didn't answer. He took one careful step closer. I felt my stomach tighten. Surely he had mistaken me for someone else. That happened occasionally, not often, but enough. He stopped less than 6 feet away. His coffee cup trembled slightly in his hand. No, he whispered. His voice sounded completely different now. It can't be. The backyard grew strangely quiet. Even the children seemed to stop shouting. Dad laughed awkwardly. Everything okay, Admiral? The Admiral ignored him. He looked directly into my eyes. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. I knew exactly who he was, and judging by his expression, he knew exactly who I was. I silently prayed he would let it go. Instead, he slowly set his coffee on the picnic table, straightened his back, and rendered me a crisp military salute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. My father stared at him in complete confusion. Jason looked from the Admiral to me. Emily, he said quietly. What's going on? I wished I had an easy answer. Instead, all I could think was that the one part of my life I'd worked hardest to keep separate from my family had just walked into my father's backyard. For a few seconds, nobody said a word. The only sound came from the grill where grease hissed against hot metal. Admiral Thomas Reynolds kept his hand raised in salute. I felt every pair of eyes in the backyard settle on me. My first instinct was to stop him. Sir, I said quietly, taking one step closer. Please, you don't have to do that. He lowered his hand, but his expression didn't soften. I do, he replied. I've wanted to for years. My father laughed nervously. I think there's been some misunderstanding. The Admiral finally turned toward him. There hasn't. His calm voice somehow made the silence even heavier. Dad forced a smile. Emily works somewhere in Washington. Government office, paperwork, I guess. I almost closed my eyes. Even now, even after all these years, that was still how he described my career. Paperwork. The Admiral looked back at me. I wasn't sure it was you until you smiled. I offered a polite nod. It's been a long time. 12 years. You remember? I remember every face from that operation. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Jason stepped beside me. What operation? Neither of us answered. The Admiral's wife gently touched his arm. Tom? He glanced at her before taking a slow breath. I won't discuss classified matters. I silently thanked him. But I will say this. He looked around at everyone gathered in the yard. My son came home because of this woman. The sentence landed like a brick. Someone accidentally dropped a plastic plate. It clattered against the concrete patio. Dad blinked twice. I'm sorry, what? My son was attached to an advisory team in northern Syria. The Admiral spoke carefully, choosing every word. They encountered a situation that deteriorated very quickly. He paused. I was later told there was a civilian intelligence officer coordinating the extraction. His eyes returned to mine. I didn't know her name until months afterward. I shifted uncomfortably. Sir, he gave me a tiny smile. I know. He wasn't trying to embarrass me. He simply believed the truth mattered. Jason looked completely lost. You've never mentioned Syria? I couldn't. You were there. I hesitated. Not exactly. Dad frowned. What does that mean? It means I wasn't on the ground. That part at least I could say. I coordinated from another location. So you planned something. I shrugged. My team did. The Admiral gently corrected me. You led that team. I didn't answer because he wasn't entirely right. Leadership during those days had been messy, complicated, shared. No single person deserved all the credit, and several of the people who truly did never came home. The thought still hit harder than I like to admit. Margaret Reynolds noticed my expression. She quietly changed the subject. You've hardly touched your lunch. I smiled. I've never been very good at eating during awkward conversations. A few people laughed. The tension eased just enough for everyone to breathe again. The dad cleared his throat. So, what exactly does Emily do? I looked at him. I work for the federal government. You always say that because it's true. He rubbed the back of his neck. You could tell your own father a little more. I legally can't. You make it sound like you're in a spy movie. His attempt at humor fell flat. I don't. The words came out more quietly than I intended. I've signed documents that don't expire when I retire. He stared at me. I could almost see him trying to decide whether I was serious. Jason spoke before he could. She's serious. Dad looked surprised. You knew? Jason shook his head. No, but I know Emily. If she's saying she can't talk, then she can't. That simple statement meant more than he probably realized. For most of my life, Jason had unknowingly benefited from our father's comparisons. Today, for the first time, He wasn't standing on the other side of them. Lunch eventually resumed, although nobody seemed very interested in hamburgers anymore. Small conversations started again. Kids returned to the yard. Someone changed the music. Life awkwardly continued. I escaped to the back porch with a bottle of water. A minute later, Admiral Reynolds joined me. "I owe you another apology," he said. "You don't owe me anything. I promised myself I'd never identify you publicly." "You didn't identify much." "I identified enough." I leaned against the railing. "It's all right. You were thinking like a father." His eyes lowered. "Exactly." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said something I hadn't expected. "My son still keeps the handwritten note." I frowned. "What note?" "The one you sent after the operation." My memory slowly returned. There had been dozens of letters, families, survivors, people asking questions I couldn't answer. One evening, I'd written a short note to every rescued service member. Just a few sentences. No signatures beyond my first name. No official seal. Simply reminding them that surviving carried responsibilities too. I barely remember writing those. "He does." The Admiral smiled faintly. "He says whenever life gets difficult, he reads it again." I swallowed. Some victories never appeared in reports. Dad opened the sliding door. "There you are." His voice was forced cheerful. "We're cutting the birthday cake." "We'll be right there," I said. He didn't leave. Instead, he looked directly at the Admiral. "Vidi so, was Emily some kind of analyst?" The Admiral considered his answer. "I've spent 44 years wearing this country's uniform." Dad nodded proudly. "I know. I've met remarkable soldiers," another pause, "and remarkable civilians." He looked at me again. "Sometimes they're the same person." Dad laughed uncertainly. "I still don't understand." "You don't need to." The Admiral's voice remained respectful. "But if Emily says she can't explain, believe her." Dad wasn't satisfied, not even close. I could tell by the way he folded his arms. By the way, his jaw tightened. For years, he'd been able to categorize everyone. Teachers, mechanics, doctors, police officers, military engineers. People made sense when they fit into neat little boxes. I didn't fit. That bothered him more than I realized. Later that afternoon, as guests began leaving, Dad walked me to my car. He waited until nobody else could hear us. "Emily?" "Yeah." "Is any of that true?" I looked at him. Every instinct told me to defend myself, to finally list everything I'd accomplished. Every deployment, every combination, every sleepless night. Instead, I simply said, "If it weren't true, Admiral Reynolds would have never saluted me." Dad opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once in his life, he had no reply. As I drove north toward Arlington that evening, my phone buzzed through the car's speakers. "We unknown number." I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. "This is Emily." A familiar voice spoke. "This is Thomas Reynolds." "Yes, sir. I hope you don't mind." "What is it?" "I'd like to invite you to Washington next month." "For what?" "There are some families who've wanted to thank you properly." My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I don't think that's a good idea." "I understand. You know, I don't attend recognition events." "I know." He paused. "But this one isn't really for you, it isn't. It's for the people who finally learned your name." I stared through the windshield as traffic rolled steadily along I-95. For the first time in years, I wasn't sure whether staying invisible was still the right choice. I ignored Admiral Reynolds' invitation for 3 days. Not because I didn't appreciate it, because I was afraid of what it might stir up. Recognition had never been part of the job. In fact, most of us learned early that if someone outside our chain of command knew our names, something had already gone wrong. I left the voicemail sitting in my inbox while life settled back into its normal rhythm. Monday morning found me exactly where I usually was, inside a secure federal building just outside Washington, D.C. The drive from my townhouse in Arlington took 25 minutes if traffic cooperated, which it almost never did. I stopped at the same coffee shop near Pentagon City, ordered the same medium black coffee, nodded to the same cashier who knew me only as Emily, and drove the remaining few blocks. That routine had become my safest place. People imagine government work is exciting every day. It isn't. Most mornings began with badge scans, security briefings, reports, and meetings where nobody raised their voice. That ordinary routine was something I'd learned to appreciate after years spent waiting for phones to ring in the middle of the night. Around 10, Clist, my office phone buzzed. "Emily Carter." This is Tom Reynolds. I smiled despite myself. Good morning, Admiral. I was hoping you'd answer. I've been thinking, and I still don't know. I expected that. He chuckled softly. I'll make it easier. I leaned back in my chair. I'm listening. The ceremony isn't about classified operations. I know it's about families. That made me pause. There will be parents, wives, husbands, children. He hesitated. They've spent years wanting to thank the people who brought their loved ones home. I rubbed my forehead. You know that's uncomfortable for me. I do, but sometimes accepting gratitude isn't vanity. His words stayed with me long after we hung up. That evening, my phone rang again. This time it was Jason. You got a minute always. You sound tired. I am. He laughed. So am I. I could hear ocean wind through his phone. He was probably walking near the beach in Coronado after work. Listen, he hesitated. Dad's been calling everybody. I sighed. I figured. He called 3 retired officers and they wouldn't tell him anything. Good. They also wouldn't tell him nothing. I smiled. That's usually how those conversations go. Jason laughed. One guy actually said, Richard, stop asking questions you don't want answered. That sounds about right. His voice grew more serious. Emily? Yeah, I'm sorry. For what? I never noticed. I frowned. What do you mean how different things were? I looked out my kitchen window toward the small maple tree in my backyard. You don't have anything to apologize for. I kind of do. He took a deep breath. Growing up, I got used to Dad talking about me, football, the academy, the teams, the promotions. He stopped. I honestly thought he treated us the same. I stayed quiet. I didn't see it. I should have. I felt something loosen inside me. Not anger, something older than that, something I'd carried for so long. It had simply become part of me. You were a kid too, so were you. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he asked, Can I ask one question? You can ask. You don't have to answer. I laughed. Fair enough. Were you ever scared? I looked toward the fading evening light. Every memory came back at once. Long nights, maps spread across tables, voices over encrypted radios, families waiting by silent phones. Friends who never made it home. Every day, I answered honestly. I just got good at working anyway. My father called the following Saturday. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, Hi, Dad. You busy? Not really. I've been thinking. I waited. I owe you a question. Okay, why didn't you ever tell us? I leaned against my kitchen counter. Tell you what, if you've done all these things, I smiled sadly. Because I couldn't. No, I mean his voice softened. Couldn't or wouldn't, both. Silence. I always thought you didn't trust us. The word surprised me. It wasn't about trust. Then what? It was about protecting people. He didn't answer, so he continued carefully. Everything that Admiral said, it was true. I've never asked anyone to exaggerate for me. Another silence. Then he quietly admitted something I never expected to hear. I've been calling old friends. I know how they told me. He actually laughed. Figures. I even called Frank Wilson, retired Colonel Frank Wilson. I'd worked with him years earlier. He wouldn't answer anything. He wouldn't. He just kept saying. Dad's voice dropped. Richard, your daughter earned every bit of your respect a long time ago. I closed my eyes. Frank had always had a way with words. Dad sounded different now. Less defensive, more confused. I don't understand why nobody will explain. They're protecting people. I raised you, I know. You still can't tell me. No. His sigh came through the phone. I guess I deserved that. No, you didn't. You deserved honesty. I just couldn't give you details. For the first time in my life, my father accepted that answer. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Heavy cream-colored paper, no return address. Inside was a formal invitation. Department of Defense Family Recognition Ceremony. Washington, D.C. Friday, then I am. At the bottom was my name, not as a guest, as an honoree. I stared at it for several minutes. Then I called Admiral Reynolds. I received it. I hoped you would. You planned this. I encouraged it. I don't belong on a stage. He laughed gently. I've watched generals argue over that exact sentence. I mean it, so do I. But this isn't about medals, it's about closure. I looked again at the invitation. I'll think about it. I'll expect nothing. Unfortunately, someone else discovered the invitation before I made my decision. My cousin Melissa called 2 days later. I heard you're speaking at some military ceremony. I blinked. Where did you hear that? Your dad, of course. He says you've somehow talked your way into being honored. I closed my eyes. What exactly did he say? That it's probably administrative work. He said you were helping organize something. I let out a slow breath. He still couldn't imagine another explanation. Not because he wanted to insult me, because the truth simply didn't fit the picture he'd carried in his head for decades. Melissa lowered her voice. You know, I think he's nervous. Nervous? He keeps asking people if they're sure they have the right Emily Carter. That actually made me laugh. I'm afraid they do. Are you going? I looked once more at the invitation lying on my dining table. I haven't decided. You should. Why? Because, she said softly, I think your dad is about to learn who his daughter really is. I didn't answer. But for the first time since Admiral Reynolds had called, I was beginning to think she might be right. I almost turned the car around twice on my way into Washington. The ceremony was being held at the National Museum of the United States Army, near Fort Belvoir, just outside the city. I'd been there once years before with coworkers after the museum opened. Back then, I blended into the crowd. Nobody looked twice at me. Today felt different. I parked in the visitors' lot just before 9:30 and sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel. My invitation was folded neatly inside my purse. I could still leave. No one would stop me. No one would blame me. The thought stayed with me until my phone buzzed. It was a text from Admiral Reynolds already inside. No pressure. If you decide to go home, I'll understand. I smiled. That was exactly why I'd agreed to come. He understood that people like me weren't comfortable being noticed. I replied with 2 words. Walking in. Inside the lobby, volunteers greeted guests and directed them toward the auditorium. Families filled the hallway. Older couples dressed in their Sunday best. Young children holding tiny American flags. Veterans wearing caps embroidered with the names of ships, units, and wars. There wasn't a trace of glamour, just ordinary Americans carrying extraordinary stories. A volunteer checked my invitation. Oh, she said, smiling warmly. Miss Carter, we've been expecting you. She handed me a name badge and quietly pointed toward the front section. Your seat is reserved. Reserved. Even that word made me uncomfortable. As I walked toward the auditorium, I heard someone call my name. Emily, I turned. Jason. He looked slightly out of place in a navy blazer instead of his usual military attire. What are you doing here? He smiled sheepishly. I got invited, you did? I didn't tell you because honestly, I wasn't sure you'd come. Before I could answer, another familiar voice interrupted us. Neither was I, Dad. He stood a few feet away wearing the same gray sport coat he wore every Easter. For a second, none of us knew what to say. Finally, he cleared his throat. I hope you don't mind. I wasn't invited. I asked if I could attend. His voice carried none of the confidence I'd heard at the birthday party, only uncertainty. I nodded. I'm glad you're here. The relief on his face was almost painful to watch. The auditorium slowly filled. About 300 people took their seats. There were no television cameras, no reporters, no politicians giving campaign speeches, just military families and the people connected to their stories. A military band quietly played patriotic music before the program began. Jason leaned toward me. You nervous a little? I've seen you calmer before, so have I, he chuckled. I've never seen Dad this nervous. I glanced across the aisle. Dad was sitting perfectly straight, turning the printed program over in his hands every few seconds. He looked like a man preparing for an exam he hadn't studied for. At exactly 10, the ceremony began. A lieutenant colonel welcomed everyone. The national anthem was sung by an army vocalist. Then several families shared brief stories. One mother spoke about waiting 72 hours without hearing from her son. Another described the phone call that finally told her her husband was alive. Nobody mentioned operations. Nobody mentioned classified missions. They talked about fear, hope, waiting, coming home. Those were things everyone understood. About 40 minutes into the ceremony, Admiral Reynolds walked to the podium. The room immediately grew quiet. He smiled toward the audience before beginning. My name is Thomas Reynolds. Like many of you, I spent most of my adult life believing courage could be measured by uniforms, rank, or medals. He paused. I was wrong. His voice remained calm. The older I become, the more I realize that some of the bravest Americans never asking to be recognized. I felt my stomach tighten. He wasn't going to. He looked directly toward my row. 12 years ago, my son was part of a mission that almost ended in tragedy. He carefully avoided every classified detail. I cannot tell you where. I cannot tell you how. But I can tell you that a small group of professionals refused to leave Americans behind. The audience listened in complete silence. My family was given another 12 years with our son because someone we'd never met refused to give up. He stepped away from the podium. For years. I wasn't permitted to thank her. He looked at me. Today, I finally can. The master of ceremonies spoke into the microphone. Emily Carter, would you please join us? For one brief second, I couldn't move. Jason gently touched my arm. Go. I slowly stood. The applause began quietly, then grew louder. As I walked toward the stage, I kept my eyes on the floor. I wasn't trying to be humble. I genuinely didn't know where to look. When I reached the front, Admiral Reynolds extended his hand. Instead of shaking it, he pulled me into a brief embrace. Then he stepped back and faced the audience. I cannot tell you everything she did. I never will, but I can tell you this. My grandchildren know their father. Because she did her job. The applause became a standing ovation. Not for me, for what the moment represented. I looked out across the room. People were crying. A woman in the second row smiled through tears. An older veteran removed his cap and held it over his heart. Then I saw my father. He was still standing, but unlike everyone else, he wasn't clapping. He simply stared at me. His eyes were red. His shoulders had slumped in a way I'd never seen before. For the first time in my life, he looked like he truly didn't recognize the daughter he'd raised. After the ceremony ended, dozens of families gathered in the reception hall. Several approached me. None asked about classified missions. None wanted dramatic stories. Instead, they said things like, "My husband made it home. My little girl got to grow up with her dad. Thank you." One elderly woman hugged me for nearly a minute without saying a word. When she finally stepped back, she smiled. "My son never told me your name. He just kept saying, 'Someone refused to quit.'" I swallowed hard. There wasn't a response big enough for moments like that. Across the room, I noticed Dad standing alone beside a window. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was watching veterans greet me, watching families shake my hand, watching people who owed me nothing treat me with a respect he'd never imagined. Jason walked over to him first. They spoke quietly. Dad nodded several times, then Jason looked toward me. A moment later, Dad slowly started walking in my direction. I knew exactly what conversation was coming, and somehow that frightened me more than anything that had happened on the stage. My father stopped a few feet away from me. For a man who had spent my entire childhood with an answer for everything, he suddenly looked as though he couldn't find a single word. People continued talking around us. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Children laughed somewhere near the refreshment table. The reception carried on, but for me, the room had narrowed to the space between my father and me. He looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier at his birthday party. Not because of the gray in his hair, because something inside him had shifted. He began, then stopped. I waited. He looked down at his hands. "I don't know where to start. You don't have to rush." He gave a weak smile. "You always were more patient than me." I almost laughed. That was probably true. For years, I'd learned patience because I hadn't had much choice. Dad glanced around the room before speaking again. "I've spent the last 2 weeks trying to figure out how I could have missed all of this." I folded my arms loosely. "You didn't miss it?" He frowned. "I just never told you." "No." He shook his head. "I never looked." That sentence caught me off guard. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a defense. It was an admission. "I kept waiting for you to do something I understood." His voice cracked slightly. "Medicine, law, teaching, the military. Something I could explain when people asked." I nodded slowly. "I know. When you wouldn't explain your job. I assumed it couldn't be very important." He laughed bitterly at himself. Turns out I was the one who didn't understand. For the first time that day, I reached out and gently touched his arm. "Dad, you don't have to apologize for not knowing." "I do." His eyes filled with tears. "I spent years telling people about Jason. I hardly ever talked about you. You didn't have to. I should have wanted to." That hurt more than anything else he'd said because it was true. Growing up, I hadn't needed him to brag about me. I'd simply wanted him to be curious, to ask, to listen, to believe that my quiet life might still matter. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I owe your brother an apology too. You don't owe Jason one. I do. He looked across the room where Jason was talking with Admiral Reynolds. I wasn't fair to either of you. I followed his gaze. Jason noticed us and walked over. You two okay? Dad looked at him. No. Jason raised an eyebrow. But maybe we're getting there. Without another word, Dad wrapped both of us in an awkward hug. We hadn't stood like that since we were children. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. Sometimes silence says exactly what words can't. A week later, Dad called and asked if he could drive up to Arlington. Just the two of us. I invited him over the following Saturday. He arrived carrying a paper bag from a local bakery. I remembered you like blueberry muffins. I smiled. You actually remembered? I remembered too late. We spent the morning drinking coffee on my back patio. The conversation wandered from childhood vacations to Mom's terrible attempts at Thanksgiving stuffing after she passed away. For the first time in years, we talked without pretending. Eventually, Dad asked the question I'd expected. Can I ask you something you can ask? I know you can't answer everything. I can't. Were you ever in danger? I looked toward the maple tree that shaded half the yard. The leaves had begun turning gold. I've had difficult days, he nodded. I figured. I've also worked with extraordinary people. The best I've ever known. He smiled faintly. The Admiral said you never wanted recognition. I didn't. So why did you go to that ceremony? I thought about it for a long moment, because I realized it wasn't really about me. It was about families. He slowly nodded. I understand that now. Then he surprised me again. I've already started fixing something. What? When people ask about my children, I tell them I have a son who trains Navy SEALs. I smiled. And I have a daughter who served this country in ways I still don't fully understand. He laughed softly. But I'm finally smart enough to admit I don't have to understand everything to be proud. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until then. Those words healed something I'd convinced myself would always stay broken. Over the next several months, things changed in small, ordinary ways. Dad called more often, not to ask about classified work, to ask how I was sleeping, whether I'd planted tomatoes again, if I wanted to come down for Sunday dinner. Jason and I started meeting halfway between Arlington and Norfolk every few weeks, usually at a little seafood restaurant in Williamsburg. We talked about everything except work. His stories involved recruits who forgot basic instructions. Mine involved my stubborn attempts to keep my vegetable garden alive, despite Virginia's unpredictable weather. It was wonderfully ordinary, exactly what both of us had needed. One afternoon, Jason looked across the table and grinned. You know what's funny? What? Dad doesn't introduce me first anymore. I laughed. He doesn't? Nope. He says, these are my kids. Just that. No comparisons, no rankings, no favorite, just his children. It sounded so simple, yet it had taken us decades to get there. Looking back now, people sometimes ask if I ever got revenge. They expect some dramatic answer, a public humiliation, a clever plan, a moment where I finally made my father feel the pain he'd caused me. But that's not what happened. The truth is much quieter. My father embarrassed himself long before I ever walked into that ceremony. I didn't expose him. The truth did. Watching him realize how little he had known about his own daughter was painful for both of us. There was no victory dance, no celebration, only an opportunity to become a better family than we had been before. That turned out to be enough. Maybe revenge isn't always about making someone lose. Sometimes it's about giving them one honest chance to see what they've been missing all along. And if they're brave enough to change, maybe everyone wins. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story reminded you that the quietest people often carry the heaviest burdens, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you enjoy stories about family resilience and hard-earned justice, I'd love for you to join me. I woke up to the smell of hospital disinfectant and the sound of my own heartbeat on a monitor. And the first face I saw wasn't my husband's worry. It was his lawyer's signature already printed at the bottom of a stack of papers. He didn't ask if I was in pain. He asked if I had a pen. 3 days later, he married another woman. He thought he'd taken everything from me. He had no idea what he was actually walking away from. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 32 years old, a major in the United States Army. And for 11 years, I built a life out of discipline. The kind of discipline that teaches you to keep your face still, even when everything inside you is falling apart. I learned that lesson fully on a Tuesday morning in a recovery room at Walter Reed, 3 hours after surgeons finished repairing the damage a training accident had done to my spine. The anesthesia hadn't fully cleared. My mouth was dry. My ribs ached with every breath, and the fluorescent lights above me felt too bright, too loud in a way that light shouldn't be able to feel. I remember blinking slowly, trying to bring the room into focus and thinking, he'll be here, he has to be here. Ethan and I had been married for 6 years. Whatever cracks had grown between us, I still believed that when it mattered, when I was lying broken in a hospital bed, my husband would walk through that door with or just his hand looking for mine. He walked in with a folder. Not flowers, not coffee, a manila folder, the kind you get from an office supply store, tucked under his arm like he was here to close on a house. He didn't sit down. He didn't touch me. He stood at the foot of the bed with the fluorescent light catching the side of his face, and he said the words so plainly, so evenly, that for a second I thought I'd misheard him through the fog of the drugs. I filed for divorce. I stared at him. My throat was still raw from the breathing tube they'd used during surgery. And I couldn't have argued, even if I'd wanted to. But it wasn't just my throat that had gone silent. It was something deeper, something that had been quietly closing itself off for longer than I wanted to admit. I looked at him, at the man I had married in a small chapel in Georgia, with my father crying in the front pew, and I felt strangely calm, not devastated. Calm the way you feel in the seconds after you already know the outcome of something, and you're just waiting for the world to catch up. He set the folder on the rolling tray beside my bed, right next to the plastic cup of water I hadn't been able to drink yet. He opened it himself, flipping through pages like he was giving a presentation to a client. He told me, in that same flat real estate voice he used when he was closing a deal, that he'd be keeping the house, the Denali, the furniture we'd picked out together at that overpriced showroom in Alexandria. He said it like he was reading off a checklist, like none of it had ever meant anything beyond its resale value. You just need to sign, he said. That's all this is. I remember looking down at my hands, an IV taped into the back of one, a hospital bracelet loose around my wrist, and thinking about how many nights I'd sat up with him when his real estate deals fell through. How many times I'd driven 4 hours back from a deployment prep just to be at his mother's birthday dinner. None of that seemed to exist in the room with us anymore. It had all been quietly erased, replaced by a folder and a pen. And then he said the thing that told me everything I needed to know about how little he'd ever actually seen me. You only make $7,000 a month, he said, not unkindly, almost like he felt sorry for me. You'll never recover financially. Not from this. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him about the trust accounts, the patents, the seat on a board he'd never once asked about in 6 years of marriage. I didn't explain that the number on my Army pay stub was the smallest fraction of what I was worth on paper or otherwise. Something in me, call it pride, call it exhaustion, call it the particular clarity that comes right after surgery when the drugs strip away everything, except the truth, decided that I didn't owe him an explanation anymore. So, I picked up the pen with my good hand and I signed. I signed the house away. I signed the car away. I signed away 6 years of Sunday mornings and shared toothbrushes and a life I had built around loving a man who in that moment couldn't even manage to ask if the surgery had gone well. He took the folder back, thanked me, actually thanked me like I'd done him a favor, and walked out of the room without looking back. I lay there afterwards, staring at the ceiling tiles, listening to my own monitor beep in steady, indifferent rhythm. I didn't cry. I kept thinking about a sentence, turning it over and over in my mind like a stone in my palm. If that's what you believe, Ethan, then let it be what you believe. 3 days later, while I was still in a hospital gown doing laps around the ward with a physical therapist holding my arm, Ethan Morgan married Vanessa Cole in a small vineyard ceremony 40 minutes outside the city. Someone sent me a photo, though I never asked for it. He was smiling in it, the kind of wide, easy smile I hadn't seen directed at me in over a year. Vanessa wore ivory. She was laughing at something just outside the frame. I looked at that photo for a long time. And then I put my phone face down on the hospital tray, and I closed my eyes and I let myself rest because somewhere underneath the ache in my back and the quiet sting of being so easily discarded, there was something else. Something Ethan didn't know was coming for him. Something he had never once thought to ask about in 6 years of marriage, because he had already decided who I was and what I was worth. He was about to find out how wrong he'd been. To understand why Ethan never saw any of this coming, you'd have to understand the kind of marriage we actually had, not the one we showed people, but the quiet architecture underneath it. The parts nobody else was invited to see. I met Ethan Morgan at a mutual friend's barbecue in Virginia Beach back when I was a captain. And he was still hungry in the good way, still building his real estate business one open house at a time. He had this easy charm, the kind that made strangers trust him within minutes. And I liked that about him. I liked that he could walk into a room and make everyone feel like the most interesting person there. I didn't know yet that the same charm that drew people to him would later be the thing he used to avoid ever really looking at me. From the beginning, I kept my finances separate and quiet. That wasn't about hiding anything from him specifically. It was about how I was raised. My father was an accountant who believed money should be seen rarely and discussed even less. And when my Uncle Frank passed away 4 years into my marriage, he left me something nobody expected: a minority stake in a small defense technology firm he'd helped found decades earlier, back when it was 3 guys in a garage in Huntsville. Alongside that came 2 patents I held jointly with him, systems related to logistics and predictive AI, that as it turned out the Army itself had eventually licensed for testing. I didn't understand the full value of any of it at first. I just knew Frank had trusted me with it, and I wasn't going to be careless with what he'd built. So, I found a wealth management firm through an old service buddy, set up a trust, and let the money grow quietly in the background of a life that otherwise looked exactly like every other military family's life. A modest 3-bedroom house, a Denali with too many miles on it, grocery coupons clipped out of habit more than necessity. I never wore anything that would have given it away. No watches, no handbags, nothing that said, "Look at what I have." Partly that was Army culture. You don't flash wealth around people who are living paycheck to paycheck on a staff sergeant salary, but partly, if I'm honest with myself now, it was a test I never admitted I was running. I wanted to know if Ethan loved the woman standing in front of him, or the version of success he assumed I represented. He failed that test slowly in small ways, long before the divorce papers ever showed up at my hospital bed. There were nights early in our marriage when I tried to talk to him about money, not to boast, but just to be honest, the way a partner should be. I remember one dinner, maybe our 3rd year together, when I started to explain that my income wasn't only the number on my lease, that there were other things, accounts, and holdings that belonged to both of us in spirit, even if the paperwork kept them separate for legal reasons. He cut me off before I even got the sentence out. "I know how military pay works, Rachel," he said, waving his fork like he was swatting away a fly. "You don't have to explain your paycheck to me." I sat there with my mouth still open around the beginning of a sentence he'd never let me finish, and something in me just closed. Not dramatically, not with tears. It was quieter than that. The way a door doesn't slam shut so much as it settles click by click until one day you realize it's been locked for years and you don't remember exactly when that happened. After that, I stopped trying to explain. I told myself it didn't matter, that a marriage wasn't a balance sheet, that love should be able to exist without either of us fully understanding the other's finances. But underneath that generous reasoning was something more honest and less comfortable. I had a husband who had already decided who I was, and he wasn't interested in updating the file. He started pulling away around year 5. I noticed the phone he angled slightly out of view during dinner. The client meetings that ran later and later into the evening, the new cologne that didn't smell like anything he owned. I'm not a fool. And I've spent over a decade reading people under pressure for a living. I knew in the specific quiet way, you know something you're not ready to say out loud yet, that he was seeing someone else. I found out her name, eventually Vanessa Cole, a client he'd sold a lake house to the year before. But by the time I had confirmation, I was 6 weeks out from a training exercise that would leave me on an operating table, and I was too depleted physically and emotionally to fight for something that had already quietly ended on his side. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a full career, a marriage that had stopped being reciprocal, and the growing awareness that you're the only one still trying. I didn't have the reserves left to save us. So, I let it happen. I let him drift, and I focused on healing my body, because at least that was a fight I still had some control over. When my lawyer, an old family friend named Diane Whitfield, reviewed the divorce filing Ethan's attorney had drawn up, she read through it twice at her desk, then looked up at me over her glasses with an expression I'll never forget, somewhere between disbelief and quiet amusement. "He listed the house and the vehicle as marital assets," she said, tapping the page, and asked for nothing else. "Rachel, does he know what's actually in your name?" I shook my head slowly. "He's never asked." Diane set the papers down, folded her hands, and smiled in a way that had nothing to do with joy, and everything to do with knowing exactly how this story was going to unfold. "Well," she said, "he's about to discover something interesting." The weeks after the divorce were by every outward measure a triumph for Ethan Morgan. He posted the wedding photos to Facebook within 48 hours, Vanessa in her ivory dress under a string of vineyard lights, Ethan in a linen suit with his tie loosened just enough to look effortless. The captions were the kind designed to be read by an audience. "Starting our forever." Sometimes the best things come when you finally choose yourself. I saw it because a mutual friend from our old church group sent it to me. Not maliciously, just with the caption, "Thought you should know before you heard it somewhere else." I looked at it once, felt a strange, distant ache that had more to do with nostalgia than heartbreak, and set my phone down. Vanessa, from what people told me, wasted no time making sure everyone knew she'd won. She wasn't cruel exactly. She was the kind of woman who mistakes volume for confidence. She talked about me at parties before she'd ever met me, calling me the boring army wife to people who still had my number in their phones. She joked that Ethan had finally traded up, that he deserved someone who understood ambition, instead of someone who spent a decade in fatigues playing soldier. Word travels in small circles, and ours was smaller than either of them realized. They went to Turks and Caicos for the honeymoon. Vanessa posted a photo of her feet in the sand next to a champagne glass with the caption, "New chapter, new life, new husband who actually provides." Ethan liked it within a minute of it going up. I know because someone screenshotted it and sent it to me with 3 separate texts of outrage on my behalf that I never asked for, but appreciated anyway. What none of them knew, what Ethan himself didn't know, standing in our old kitchen, bragging to his buddies about keeping the house, like he'd won some kind of negotiation, was that the house had never been the asset that mattered. He kept the physical shell of our marriage, the mortgage, which was underwater by more than either of us wanted to admit after the market correction the year before. The Denali, 3 years old with a check engine light that came on intermittently, and that he'd been putting off having looked at. The furniture, half of which I'd bought secondhand, and refinished myself on weekends, when I was home between deployments. Mess, he'd kept the props, the set dressing, everything that photographed well, and meant almost nothing on a balance sheet. What he hadn't asked for, because he didn't know it existed, was the actual architecture of what I owned. The minority stake in the defense firm my Uncle Frank had left me, which had quietly tripled in value over 4 years. As the company won 2 federal contracts, nobody outside a small circle of investors had heard about yet. We the brokerage account that held it along with a diversified portfolio. My wealth manager, a sharp non-nonsense woman named Patricia and Camelu, had built for me with the kind of patience that compounds over a decade into real money. The 2 patents still generating modest but steady licensing income from the very branch of the army I served in, a detail that, had he known, it might have made him laugh at the irony, or might have made him furious that he'd never once thought to ask what logistics systems consultant meant on my old fellowship paperwork. None of it was simply hidden through deception. Because he'd never once created the space where volunteering it felt safe and under the law. Because every bit of it predated our marriage or came to me through inheritance and intellectual property. I held independently. None of it was subject to division. My attorney Diane made sure the settlement reflected that with surgical precision. The house, the car, the joint checking account, nothing more. I didn't fight for a larger share. I didn't need to. I let him walk away certain he'd won, because in his mind winning meant keeping the things he could see. I remember Diane asking me once over coffee, after the paperwork was finalized, whether I wanted to make sure he understood what he was missing before he signed everything. She said it delicately, professionally, the way lawyers do, when they're offering you a form of justice, but want you to choose it yourself. I could make sure the language in the settlement makes it clear what your full net worth is, she said. Some people want their ex to know exactly what they lost. I thought about it for a long moment, stirring my coffee slowly, watching the steam curl up and disappear. No, I said finally. Let him find out on his own. Let it come from the world, not from me. There was something in me that needed it that way. Not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of dignity I wasn't willing to give up, even in the face of everything he'd taken. I didn't want my worth to be a weapon I brandished at him on my way out the door. I wanted him to simply meet the truth naturally in his own time, the way he should have met it years earlier, if he'd ever cared enough to look. So, I signed my part of the settlement, closed that chapter as quietly as I'd lived through it, and went back to physical therapy, back to work, back to the long, unglamorous process of rebuilding a body that had been through surgery, and a life that had just been legally rewritten in under 20 minutes at a courthouse in Fairfax County. I didn't think about Ethan much in those first days. I assumed, if I thought of him at all, that he'd go on living exactly the small, self-satisfied life he'd chosen, and that our paths would simply drift apart, the way most divorced couples do, through obligation at first, then indifference, then nothing at all. I didn't know yet how quickly all of that would change. On the fourth day after the settlement was finalized, an envelope arrived at Ethan's new address. Official letterhead, a federal seal in the corner. It wasn't addressed from me, or from Diane, or from anyone connected to our divorce at all. It was the first thread in a fabric that was about to come completely undone. Ethan told me the story himself, months later, in a conversation neither of us expected to have, but piecing it together with what I already knew from the paperwork that eventually crossed my desk, this is how that morning actually unfolded. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter for almost an hour before he opened it. Vanessa noticed it first. She was the type to notice mail to open bills before her second cup of coffee, out of some anxious habit she'd carried from a childhood where money had always been tight. She turned it over in her hand, saw the government seal, and called out to Ethan from the kitchen, only half paying attention. "Something came for you. Looks official." He opened it, standing at the counter, still in his undershirt, coffee going cold beside him. It was a formal notice from a federal contracting oversight office, addressed to him only because his name had appeared tangentially in a due diligence file, connected to a company he'd never heard of. The letter was dense with the kind of institutional language that takes 3 reads to fully understand. But the gist of it, once it landed, hit like a dropped weight. A defense technology firm was undergoing a routine ownership and compliance review, ahead of a new contract award, and his own name had surfaced. Because, as the letter explained almost as an afterthought, his former spouse held a documented equity stake in the company, and his own recent loan applications and personal financial disclosures, filed during the last 2 years of our marriage, had listed household assets in ways that no longer reconciled with public filings now coming to light. He read it twice, he told me later, without understanding a single sentence of it beyond the words, "Your former spouse holds equity." The phone rang before he'd even set the letter down. It was his bank, the one holding the loan on a rental property he'd used to expand his real estate portfolio 2 years earlier. A loan he'd personally guaranteed, in part using financial statements that had included my income as part of our household's combined resources at the time, back when we still filed jointly. The loan officer's voice was polite, careful, the way people are when they're about to deliver news they know will not be well received. They were reviewing the file. There'd been a discrepancy flagged in an audit. Given the recent divorce and the sudden absence of the income that had been used to qualify for the original terms, they needed updated documentation. And soon Ethan hung up, he said, feeling the first genuine spike of panic he'd felt in years. Then the second call came. His attorney, the one who'd handled the divorce, calling not out of concern, but out of professional caution, informing him that a routine title search on the House Standard Procedure, now that Ethan was refinancing it into his name alone, had turned up references to trust holdings and intellectual property assignments connected to Rachel Morgan that hadn't been part of the divorce disclosures, and asking delicately whether Ethan had been fully aware of his ex-wife's financial position at the time of settlement. By the third call, this one from the IRS regarding an inconsistency in a joint filing from 2 years prior, one that had claimed deductions based on income levels that public records now suggested were significantly understated. Ethan was sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets, the phone pressed so hard against his ear that Vanessa said later she could hear the tiny voice from across the room. 3. She stood in the doorway watching him. She told a mutual friend afterward, the color draining slowly out of his face like something being poured out of a glass. "What is going on?" she kept asking. "Ethan, what is going on?" He didn't answer her at first. He was too busy connecting a set of facts that had been sitting in plain sight for years. Facts he'd simply never bothered to look at, because he'd already decided, long before any of this, exactly what kind of woman he'd married. There was a real estate deal, too. The one he'd been chasing for months. A mixed-use development outside Richmond that would have been the biggest commission of his career. His investment partner on that deal, a man named Carl Denning, who'd been quietly running his own background checks, as a matter of standard practice, before finalizing a 7-figure commitment, called that same afternoon to say he was pulling out. Carl didn't accuse Ethan of anything outright. He simply said, in the careful language of men who've decided not to burn a bridge, but also don't intend to walk across it again, that certain representations Ethan had made about his personal financial standing during their early conversations didn't seem to hold up. And that he thought, at best, they part ways before any documents were signed. Ethan told me later that this was the moment it truly landed. Not the bank, not the IRS letter, not even the divorce lawyer's careful question. It was Carl's voice, flat and final, telling him that his credibility, the thing he'd spent 15 years building in an industry, built entirely on trust and reputation, had just quietly evaporated because of assumptions he'd made about a woman he never bothered to actually know. Vanessa's panic surfaced almost immediately after that call ended. She'd married him, believing in her own words later that he was about to be a millionaire once the divorce settlement cleared, and his real estate career kept climbing the way he'd always promised her it would. She sat across from him at the kitchen table that evening, her voice climbing in pitch, as she asked the question that, in hindsight, should have been asked years earlier by someone else entirely. "I thought she was broke," Vanessa said. "You told me she made nothing. You told me the house and the truck were the whole picture." Ethan didn't answer. He opened his laptop instead, hands shaking slightly, and typed my name into a search bar, for what he later admitted was the first time in 6 years of marriage. What came back stopped him cold. A patent filing my name, listed as co-inventor alongside my late uncle. A brief mention in a defense industry trade publication about a small firm's board editions following a contract win. A short bio on an alumni page from a fellowship program I'd completed years earlier, describing systems work that had nothing to do with the woman he thought he'd been married to. None of it was dramatic, none of it was flashy. It was just quietly, undeniably real years of my actual life, laid out in black and white, available the entire time to anyone who'd cared enough to look. He sat there, he told me later, staring at the screen until the words blurred, feeling something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the sudden sickening understanding of how little he had actually known the person he'd shared a bed with for 6 years. He picked up his phone and called me. I looked at the screen, watched his name light up against the dark, and let it ring until it went to voicemail. He called 4 more times that night. I watched the screen light up, each time from across my kitchen, the phone buzzing softly against the counter, like something trying to get my attention that I had already decided didn't deserve it. I didn't feel triumphant watching it happen. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to tell this part of the story like a victory lap, and it wasn't. It was quieter than that, sadder in some ways. I just felt the strange hollow calm of watching a house of cards finally catch the wind it had been standing against for years. I found out most of what happened next the way everyone else did, through the slow, unglamorous decay of a life built on assumptions visible in fragments, through mutual friends, old co-workers, and eventually Ethan himself. Vanessa unraveled first and fastest. She had married a version of Ethan that existed mostly in his own telling of himself. Successful ascending a man on the verge of the kind of wealth that would let her stop worrying about the things she'd grown up worrying about. When that version started coming apart, she didn't handle it with grace. She started asking questions in front of other people at dinners at the gym in a way that made their mutual friends deeply uncomfortable. "Did you know he lied about the divorce settlement?" she reportedly asked one of Ethan's college friends at a birthday party, loud enough that 3 other people heard it, and within a week, so had I. The whispers moved fast in the tight little social circle they shared. People began quietly comparing notes, noticing for the first time how much of Ethan's confidence had always rested on a story about money that had never quite added up if you looked closely. Old friends who had once toasted his second marriage at the vineyard started finding reasons to be busy when he called. It wasn't dramatic or cruel. Mostly, it was just the slow social erosion that happens when people realize they've been sold a version of someone that didn't exist. Financially, things moved even faster than socially. The refinance on the house fell through entirely once the bank finished its review. And without it, Ethan couldn't cover the balloon payment structure he and I had originally set up years earlier, under very different financial assumptions. He tried to sell the house instead, but the market had shifted since we bought it. And after months of it sitting with barely any interest, he was forced to list it nearly $40,000 under what we'd paid. The Denali, the one he'd been so proud to keep from our marriage, needed almost $6,000 in transmission repairs he no longer had easy access to fund, not with legal fees from the loan disputes stacking up, and credit card balances from a wedding that had been by every account. I heard considerably more expensive than either of them could actually afford. Carl Denning's withdrawal from the Richmond deal had a ripple effect. Ethan hadn't anticipated in an industry that runs on relationships and reputation word travels through exactly the kind of small, interconnected circles that had once made Ethan's career possible. 2 other potential deals quietly stalled out over the following months, not through any direct accusation, but through the kind of soft, unspoken hesitation that settles over a person once their credibility has been publicly questioned. He kept working, kept showing up to open houses with the same easy smile, but something in the confidence had shifted, and clients can sense that kind of thing, even when they can't name it. Vanessa's frustration curdled into something sharper. As the months went on, I heard through the same network of mutual acquaintances that had once passed me photos of their wedding, that she'd started saying things to him in front of people that weren't meant to be repeated, but were anyway. "You ruined my life," she reportedly told him at a dinner party that ended early and awkwardly, the kind of sentence that lands heavier in front of witnesses than it would have in private. I don't know if that's exactly what she said. I only know that the story reached me from 3 separate sources within the same week, which told me something about how visible the cracks in their marriage had already become. I want to be clear that I took no pleasure in hearing any of it. There's a particular kind of sadness in watching a life you were once part of collapse from the outside, even when the person at the center of it caused his own downfall. I remembered the man Ethan had been at 28, hungry and funny and genuinely kind in the early years, before ambition curdled into entitlement, before he decided my worth could be measured entirely by a number on a pay-ub. Some nights, hearing another piece of the story secondhand, I felt something closer to grief than satisfaction. Grief for the marriage that could have been if he'd ever once been curious enough to really know me. But I didn't call him. I didn't reach out to offer comfort or clarity, or anything at all. I let him sit inside the consequences of a life he'd built on assumptions because that was the only education left that might actually reach him. While all of that was unfolding around him, my own life moved forward in a much quieter rhythm. I finished my physical therapy program in 11 weeks, a full month ahead of what the doctors had projected, mostly through sheer stubbornness and the kind of discipline the Army had spent over a decade drilling into me. I returned to my unit on modified duty, easing back into the work I'd built my whole adult identity around. I sat in on a defense technology conference in Huntsville as a board observer for my uncle's old company, listening to engineers half my age talk about systems I'd helped shape years earlier, feeling something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with Ethan at all. A sense that my life, the actual substance of it, had never needed his belief in it to be real. Then, on a Tuesday evening in early spring, almost 5 months after the divorce papers first landed in my hospital room, my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. Ethan's name sat above it on the screen, and beneath it a small number I hadn't seen attached to his contact in years. 4 minutes and 12 seconds long. I stared at it for a long moment, before I finally pressed play. His voice on the recording didn't sound like the man who'd stood at the foot of my hospital bed with a folder under his arm. It sounded smaller, tired in a way I hadn't heard from him even in our worst years together. "Rachel," he started, and then there was a long pause, long enough that I almost thought the message had cut off. "I don't even know what to say that doesn't sound like an excuse. I know I don't deserve you calling me back. I need you to know I know now. I know what I did. I know what I threw away. And I'm not talking about the house." He kept going, his voice catching in places, admitting things in fragments that he'd been ashamed to call his own father about, the loan situation that Vanessa had moved in with her sister 2 weeks earlier, that he'd started seeing a therapist for the first time in his life, not because he wanted to, but because he genuinely didn't understand how he'd become a person who could stand in a hospital room and hand his wife divorce papers, instead of asking if she was in pain. He said my name 3 more times in the message, each time a little quieter, like he was testing whether it still meant anything for him to say it. I listened to the whole 4 minutes and 12 seconds twice before I decided anything. Then I called Diane, not for legal advice this time, just to talk it through, the way you talk something through with someone who's watched the whole story unfold from the very beginning. She listened, and then she asked the only question that mattered. "Do you want to see him?" I sat with that question for 3 days before I had an answer, not because I was afraid of him anymore. There was nothing left in me that feared Ethan Morgan, no leftover tenderness sharp enough to hurt. I took the time, because I wanted to be sure that if I agreed to meet him, it would be for the right reason, not to gloat, not to let him see what he'd lost laid out in front of him like a trophy. I agreed to meet him because I realized somewhere in that quiet stretch of days that I still had one thing left to say, and I owed it to myself to say it out loud rather than let it sit unspoken forever. We met on a Thursday afternoon at a small coffee shop in Old Town Neutral Ground, the kind of place neither of us had any history with. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, and I almost didn't recognize him at first. He'd lost weight, not in the deliberate gym-honed way he used to talk about at dinner parties, but in the tired, sleepless way that comes from stress eating away at a person from the inside. He stood up when he saw me, and for a second neither of us said anything at all. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his voice rougher than I remembered. I sat down across from him, ordered nothing, and let him talk first, because I could see he needed to get it out before he lost his nerve. He cried eventually somewhere in the middle of it. Not the performative kind of crying I might have expected from him once, but something quieter, more involuntary, like it surprised even him. He told me he was sorry, that he understood now how badly he'd failed to see me, that he'd let a number on a pay-up become the entire measure of my worth, because it was easier than actually asking who I was underneath the uniform. Me, he said. Vanessa had used him almost as much as he'd used his own assumptions about me. That once the money didn't materialize the way she expected, she'd made it very clear what she'd actually married him for. He said it without much bitterness, mostly just exhaustion, like a man recounting a fever dream he was finally waking from. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt, didn't offer the comfort of forgiveness, before he'd earned the space to say what he needed to say. When he was done, when the silence between us had stretched long enough that the barista 2 tables over had refilled our neighbor's coffee, twice, I finally spoke, and I kept up my voice even without a trace of triumph in it. I didn't lose a marriage because I made less money, Ethan, I said. I lost one because you never cared enough to actually know me. He flinched at that, more than he had at anything the banks, or the lawyers, or Carl Denning had told him in the months before. I think some part of him had hoped, walking into that coffee shop, that this conversation would end with some kind of financial reconciliation, some acknowledgement on my part of what he'd lost in dollar terms. I made sure that was never on the table. I hadn't come to talk about money. I'd never once in this entire ordeal needed him to know exactly what I was worth in numbers. What I needed him to understand, what I think finally in that small coffee shop he actually did understand, was that the real loss had nothing to do with a stake in a defense company or a set of patents. It was the years he'd spent standing next to a woman he never bothered to truly meet. I reached into my bag and set a plain envelope on the table between us. Inside were copies of the original divorce papers, the same ones he'd handed me in that hospital room, along with a short handwritten note I'd drafted the night before. The kind of note that doesn't ask for anything back. I wasn't giving him closure out of forgiveness exactly. I was giving it to myself, closing a door I'd been holding half open in some quiet corner of my mind since the moment he walked in with that folder under his arm. I hope you figure out who you actually want to be. I told him, standing up before either of us could turn the moment into something bigger than it needed to be. I mean that. I didn't wait for his response. I didn't need one. I walked out of that coffee shop into the ordinary brightness of a Thursday afternoon, past people going about lives that had nothing to do with mine. And I didn't look back over my shoulder the way people do in movies when they want to see if the other person is watching them leave. I already knew he was. It didn't matter anymore. Nearly a year passed after that afternoon before Ethan Morgan crossed my path again. And when he did, neither of us was expecting it. A year is a long time when you spend it rebuilding instead of grieving. By the time the invitation arrived, a formal card, embossed lettering, an evening reception hosted by a National Defense Innovation Council, I almost didn't recognize the woman it was addressed to. Major Jill Morgan, recipient of a commendation for contributions to next-generation logistic systems, work that had grown directly out of the patents my Uncle Frank had left me. Work I'd spent the better part of a decade quietly building alongside my actual career. The one nobody ever needed to see the dollar signs behind to understand. I almost didn't go. Ceremonies like that had never been my language. I'd spent my whole adult life more comfortable in a briefing room than a ballroom. More at ease giving orders under pressure than accepting applause under chandeliers. But my old physical therapist, who'd become something like a friend over the 11 weeks of recovery, talked me into it over coffee one Sunday morning. "You don't owe anyone humility forever, Rachel," she said. "Let people see what you built." So I went. I wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry beyond my late mother's small gold earrings, and I stood in a hotel ballroom in Arlington, surrounded by generals, engineers, defense contractors, and colleagues who had known me only through the quiet, steady version of myself. I'd always presented capable, understated, unbothered by attention. My commanding officer gave a short speech about the systems I'd helped develop, how they'd already saved real money and real time in 3 active deployments. My old teammates from the unit sat at a table near the front, cheering louder than the room's dignity probably called for, and I laughed genuinely for what felt like the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. I wasn't hiding anymore. Not my success. Not the years of work behind it. Not the quiet architecture of a life I'd built entirely on my own terms. But I also wasn't performing it for anyone. I accepted the combination, the way I'd lived most of my career steadily, without needing the room's validation to know it mattered. It was near the end of the evening as servers began clearing dessert plates, and the string quartet shifted into something slower that I saw him. Ethan was standing near the edge of the room, not as a guest, exactly. I learned later he'd come with a cousin who worked event logistics for the hotel, helping oversee the catering staff for the night. He looked different, thinner still, but steadier somehow, like a man who'd stopped running from something and had finally turned to face it instead. He wore a simple black suit, nothing like the linen he'd worn at his wedding, and when our eyes met across the room, there was no performance in his expression at all. No charm, no real estate smile, just something quiet and a little sad, and underneath that something that looked almost like peace. He started toward me, and for a moment, my chest tightened with the old familiar bracing I used to feel before difficult conversations with him. But it passed quickly, the way storms do, once you've weathered enough of them to know their shape. He didn't come to make a scene, and I could see that plainly in the careful way he approached, hands in his pockets, shoulders a little lower than I remembered them. "You look happy," he said when he finally reached me. It wasn't a line. It didn't have an angle behind it. It was just an observation offered plainly the way you'd tell an old friend something true. "I am," I said, and I meant it completely. He nodded, glanced briefly at the combination still pinned near my collar, and opened his mouth like he wanted to say more. Maybe another apology, maybe some explanation for why he was standing in a hotel ballroom in a caterer's black suit, instead of the life he'd once been so certain he was building. But I didn't need to hear it, and some quiet clarity in his own face told me he understood that, too. "Take care of yourself, Ethan," I said. And I meant that completely as well, not as a dismissal, not as a parting shot, but as something closer to genuine hope for a man I'd once loved, even if that love hadn't been enough to survive what he'd chosen to believe about me. Then I turned and walked back toward my table, back toward the people who had actually shown up for me across 11 years of deployments and recoveries and quiet, unglamorous work. And I didn't look back to see whether he was still standing there watching me go. I didn't need to. I already knew the answer, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't hold any weight over me at all. Driving home that night, windows cracked to let in the cool spring air. I thought about everything that had happened since that morning, in the hospital room, the folder, the signature, the quiet unraveling that followed the coffee shop conversation that closed the last real door between us. And I realized the truest thing I'd learned through all of it wasn't about money or vindication or even forgiveness. It was this. Ethan had spent 6 years believing my worth began and ended with a number on a pay stub. But the biggest thing he ever lost wasn't my income. And it was never really about the house or the car or the life he assumed he'd won by walking away first. It was the woman who had loved him quietly, patiently, and completely long before he ever thought to ask what she was really worth. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear which part hit you the hardest. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Stories like Rachel's remind us that real strength often looks quiet, that dignity can be its own kind of victory, and that the people who truly know our worth are the ones who never needed a number to see it. We share stories like this every single day. So, if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe now. Let's keep walking through these stories together, one honest moment at a time.